Hey, Steve Mioni here doing the Junkyard Crawl at Burleson Auto Wrecking in Burleson, Massachusetts. You know, it's hard to imagine that this Gen 3 Camaro, this one's a 1984, is almost 40 years old. It's 2022 right now. Do the math, 84 to 2022. That's like, what, 38 years? So when this car was new, a 38-year-old car was from the 1950s. Crazy but true. If you're old enough, well, you remember when these things were new. Now keep in mind, 1984 was the peak year for third generation Camaro output with a total of 261,500 and change built. In fact, that was better output than any year from the first gen, 67, 8, or 9, of which about 230,000 per year were made on average. So if anybody says that the desire for pony cars was done in the 80s, not true. Again, there were 261,500 of these things built in 1984. Now keep in mind, a lot of people also say that V8s are on the way out and it was all about front-wheel drive and four-cylinder engines in the 80s. Well, think again, of those 261,500 Camaros, about 152,000 were V8 powered, 98,000 were V6 powered, and just 10,000 had the four-cylinder engine. So people still wanted V8s in their Camaros in 1984, as they do now. Okay, which one of those three engines do we have here? Now, we know it's not a Z28, it's got a flat hood, right? Well, let's dig in. Let's pop that hood. Okay, now it's kind of weird. This hood does have the underling markings, the bracing here, of a Z28 style hood. In fact, the later IROC Z style hood. So something's up here. And it's a mystery we can solve by looking right here at this tag. It says 5.0 liter and also the 1989 model year. So like so many Camaros, this thing got punched in the nose. This is a replacement hood. This is the V6 engine the car was born with. And keep in mind, of those 261,500 Camaros, again, about 98,000 people paid the extra $250 over the 151 four-banger for this V6. Now, this has 107 horsepower. It's 2.8 liters, or to you and I, 173 cubic inches. Now, this is what we call a 60-degree V6. It's done on a fairly narrow 60-degree angle, and this same engine was used in Citations and even in the Fiero GT. But something kind of cool on the top, it says 2.8 liter multi-port fuel injection, and that's a reference to the fact that it has a single throttle body up here, but the ram tubes, yes, these are ram tubes, allow a slight increase in torque, kind of like what the Ram Chargers 1960 through 64 long ram Chrysler 300s and cross ram Hemis, and even the fuel injected 57 through 65 Corvette utilize ram tuning. If these runners were pulled out to full length, they'd be about a foot long. And keep in mind, these take advantage of naturally occurring harmonics, which allow a slight form of supercharging, which is something that General Motors absolutely was shooting for. So that's kind of cool. It's a ram-tuned intake manifold here on this fuel-injected car. Now, it does have air conditioning, the C60 air conditioning. It is interesting to note how short that V6 is and how much room there is between the radiator and the water pump pulley right there. So again, not a V8 car, but yes, you could get the 305 in 1984 with the crossfire injection or with a single four barrel, or in the base cars, non-Z28, you could actually get a central fuel-injected 305, I think 160 or 140 horsepower, something like that. But again, a V6 car, this one right here. So this hood, definitely a 1989 hood that was added after this thing probably took a slight hit in the front. So Shane, you walk around to that side, I'll meet you here. Well, let's look inside for another surprise. Now again, a lot of folks talk about the death of the manual transmission. Well, as you get into the 70s, it is true that manual transmissions were less common and automatics kind of took over. That was because certifying engine transmission combinations for emissions and fuel economy was expensive. So what manufacturers would quite often do is they would certify the automatic and maybe one manual. Well, on this car, the base transmission would have been a 4-speed. Well, somebody paid an extra $125 for this 5-speed. Now, the beauty of the 5-speed, and we can see right here, here's the shifter, and here's the boot with the number 5 right there. And then 1984, this was kind of a special tranny because that 5th gear was overdrive, which gave this car better fuel economy, really, than it would have had with the standard 1-to-1 4-speed. Does have the tape player right here. This is the Delco GM. Remember tapes right there? And this one does have, I think, auto reverse. Yeah, you push this button right here, and what happens is you can go from side A to side B without taking the tape out and turning it over, which is what you do on an old school analog tape player. Now this does have the speedometer here that goes to 80 miles per hour, something that we'd see on Camaros through the 1988 model year. And again, that was a hangover of the dark 1970s when the federal government says, you know, if we tell people they can only go 80 miles an hour and by the speedometer, they'll only go 80 miles per hour. And keep in mind also, there was a 55 mile per hour national limit on federal highways. So the 55 mile per hour thing with Sammy Hagar, I can't drive 55. Well, here is a living reminder of those ugly, ugly days. But again, you know, every vehicle has its place. And this one here, speaking of place, was built in Norwood, Ohio, which is where all Camaros were built, for the most part, from 1967 through 1987. Now, Van Nuys, California was an alternate plant for Camaro output, but this one has an N in the VIN, which tells us it was built at Norwood. Now, something cool about Norwood, a fellow named Philip Boris wrote this book called Echoes of Norwood, and this basically is a nice thick book describing the history of the Norwood, Ohio plant. And basically the strikes with the union guys, the UAW, the battles. You know, sometimes you say, man, I'd love to work in a factory building cars. Well, the reality is, you know, an 8-hour shift, you know, popping these AC vents into position over and over and over 5 days a week would probably get monotonous. So the unions and, you know, management quite often fought tooth and nail. They both had their strong points. But this is a wonderful book. It shows pictures of all the great Camaros and cars that came out of Norwood, Ohio. Now this book came out maybe about 10 years ago, something like that. And Philip Boris, again, is one of the guys. He's really into low VIN and pilot cars. So Google Philip Boris. Now he did a second book, this one here called Visions of Norwood. It's a pickup. And this one talks about the F cars, the Camaros. And this book is really cool. It basically follows the assembly of a Camaro in color pictures from beginning to end down the Norwood assembly line. And Norwood, Ohio, of course, was in production from, I guess, the 1920s through 1987 when GM finally closed it down and basically just razed the entire place. You can see right here these final pictures. So this Camaro, if it could talk, this 1984 Camaro Sport Coupe V6 5-speed manual came from Norwood, Ohio. And the guys who worked in these books right here put this thing together. And it's really a fascinating thing. That was before computers and robots really kind of took over the majority of automotive installation. So somewhere along the line, 2 or 3 guys actually manhandled this plastic dashboard into the car, screwed it in place with equipment that was automated. But again, a lot of DNA inside this car. If you get a crime scene investigation going on, you'd certainly find, you know, traces of the people who put it together, a little bit of soul and a little bit of spirit in every one of these cars built before the advent of you know, robot assembly. Let's go to the back of the car, something else here worth looking at. Now, another thing that's kind of out of place is this, the centrally mounted stoplight. This arrived in '86. So what's it doing on this '84? Is it a pre-production prototype? No. I dare say that somewhere along the line, either the deck lid or the hatch needed to be replaced, and this is a replacement from a later Camaro. They're interchangeable. They all fit with no problems at all. And again, you know, here's a great example of the Camaro Sport Coupe 5-speed manual. V6 power. You know, this is how, you know, like about a third of Camaros built in 1984 were fleshed out. They weren't all Z28s. And I got to say, in 1987, I graduated from college, 86, and I got a job at a place called Ragsdale Chevrolet in Spencer, Massachusetts. And I actually sold some Camaros. In fact, a guy came in and he bought a 4-cylinder Sport Coupe, base car, 4-speed manual transmission, hubcaps, a very, very austere car. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I should take pictures of this thing. Well, that was before digital cameras, so I didn't have film and it never happened. But again, it's interesting to be part of the history of these cars. I was a salesman. You know, I sold like 43 cars in the 3 months I was working as a Chevy salesman. And one thing I learned about selling cars is that there's a big difference between liking cars and selling cars. I'm good at liking cars. I wasn't so good at selling them. But with that said, it's hard to imagine. This is 38 years old. To me, it's a couple of years old, but that's what happens if you stick around long enough. So if you like this video and you want to see more of this kind of thing, subscribe to the Steve Maggs YouTube channel.